Everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of webinars discussing the proposed Commission on Defence. As a community, as a defence community, we feel that this is a once-in-a-generational opportunity to address some of the fundamental obstacles to Ireland having the military capability it needs to face the modern threats of the 21st century, from cyber to hybrid to general destabilisation. We hope that this series of webinars can help to ensure that the Defence Forces and Ireland, of course, that the Defence Forces has the roles, the responsibility and the resources it needs to defend Ireland in this 21st century. We've had a series of panels drawn from various groups, from academics to former military senior officers, to our political representatives. And tonight we are delighted to be joined by our esteemed colleagues from the business community, a perspective that I feel is sometimes the least heard perspective on defence in Ireland, and something that's very close to my own heart, of course. We are joined by four speakers who will bring a wealth of experience from the commercial world, and also each individually have a really interesting perspective on defence and where Ireland should be looking. Our speakers this evening, we are starting off with Dr. Ray Mcnulty, President at Stratagem Partners and at Price Partners. Ray was also, very interestingly, a member of the Price Waterhouse team who undertook two separate reviews of the Defence Forces in the 1990s. Ray will discuss the process during these reviews and the key lessons that was learned during that. He will draw upon his experience from helping governments, industry and large organisations deal with strategic challenges and share his views on how these might be applied to the Irish Defence Forces. These challenges, from his perspective, include Brexit, cyber, economic warfare, pandemics, climate emergencies, and connected risks. Our second speaker this evening will be from Neil McDonnell, CEO of the Irish Small and Medium Enterprise Association, and former member of the Defence Forces. Neil will be considering why there are so few business opportunities for SMEs and why it's such a taboo subject in Ireland. He will be looking at the impact that the Defence Forces and its wider network can have on Ireland's global footprint, and considering how we can increase the interplay between the Defence Forces, the political and the business world. Our third speaker, Kevin McPartlan, CEO of Fuels for Europe. Kevin will address the importance of early and persuasive engagement with government to ensure the Commission on Defence is a genuine analysis of the state's defence capability, rather than just an admittedly vital issue of members' paying conditions. And Kevin will offer advice on how this might be achieved. Paul Farrell, Country General Manager for IBM Ireland. Paul will be discussing the economic imperatives for a strong defence posture in today's fractured global economy. He'll be looking specifically at the role of cybersecurity in that defence posture and how Ireland can benefit economically and socially from a grown-up debate on defence. Each of our speakers will be given the opportunity to lay out their thoughts and their positions for between 8 to 10 minutes. And at the end of those four speakers, we'll be delighted to take questions from our virtual floor that I'll moderate to our speakers. So without further ado, I'll call on our first speaker, Dr. Ray Mcnulty, to start this evening. Ray has over 30 years of experience as an international business advisor. His major focus is corporate strategy, with a particular emphasis on market disruption, innovation, and risk. Ray has a successful track record in managing the development, turnaround, and growth of major consulting, technology, services, and telecoms businesses. Prior to his current role, he held senior executive roles with Berkeley Research Group, Navigant Consulting, Aircom, IBM, and PA Consulting Group. Ray has been a member of a number of government, regulatory and policy advisory groups concerned with the future of several industry sectors. And as I mentioned earlier, Ray was also a member of the Price Waterhouse team, which undertook two separate reviews of the Defence Forces during the 1990s. Ray, over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Can you hear me? Great. So these opinions are personal opinions and don't necessarily represent the views of my prior firm, Price Waterhouse. And in my current role, I have reasonable access to the international defence industry, and many security issues are part of the risks issues that we deal with on behalf of clients. And really what we're seeing is that defence, security and related risk management issues are not the sole domain of any individual agency. And over the last 20 years, I've seen the blurring of responsibilities and roles spanning stakeholders across public and private sectors in this regard. The key messages from my contribution this evening are: first, the defence and security risks are complex, volatile and unstable that we face today. Secondly, increasingly we will be confronted by the unthinkable and the unpalatable. And then traditional approaches, tools and budgets don't meet the needs of current challenges. And really we need to stand back and take a holistic approach to defining current and future requirements. This needs wide stakeholder engagement and buy-in across the entire ecosystem. And we also need to radically look at different and dynamic solutions which are adequately funded. As Pat said, I worked on both reviews of the Defence Forces during the 1990s. At the time, I was a director at Price Waterhouse, and my role was a subset of the overall review and focused on understanding what the military actually did, what was the value of its contribution, and identifying opportunities for improvement. I was the single Price Waterhouse representative on a military team, effectively, which undertook the work, and the team was led by 3 officers who you all probably know: Ralph James from the Air Corps, Jerry Luttrell from the Naval Service, and Wally Frayne who was obviously very famous in his time. The key issues were that there was no basis to evaluate the activities undertaken by the Defence Forces. Decisions were largely being made on the basis of size of expenditure or perceived value, or possibly even hearsay. And there was no scientific or semi-scientific method to evaluate the value of the Defence Forces. And certainly there was no common view shared between major stakeholders, including the government department, and possibly between the Army, Navy and Air Corps. And there was no basis to evaluate the relative contribution of one activity versus another. For example, why was it acceptable to reduce training spend rather than fisheries protection spend? So the starting point for the work we undertook was to define the mission or purpose of the Defence Forces. And that's quite a fundamental step. And this needed to look at both the current situation and the potential future scenarios and risks. And the work was undertaken in working sessions with the general officers commanding, other senior officers, the department, and we, as Price Waterhouse, provided military experts to facilitate and contribute to the debate. The most senior of those was the Canadian General Lou Mackenzie, who was the first UN commander in Sarajevo. We then facilitated definition of what we call key result areas, which supported delivery of the mission or the purpose of the Defence Forces. And these were defined as the optimum outcome and results for the organisation to be successful. We then identified and agreed the definition of all activities and tasks undertaken by the Defence Forces. And these were summarised into between 300 or 400 high-level activities. Examples might include drug interdiction, agent civil power, vehicle maintenance, stores maintenance, guard duty, and whatever. And all activities were categorised as either fundamental or discretionary activities. And fundamental activities were defined as those activities that there was a legal requirement to undertake, or those activities which the organisation needed to undertake, or it would be unable to function. So, for example, aircraft maintenance will be a fundamental activity for the Air Corps. Without it, planes wouldn't fly. All other activities are categorised as discretionary. That's not to say that they weren't important. The key difference between fundamental and discretionary activities were you could choose to cease discretionary activities. For example, you could stop aircraft maintenance. You couldn't stop aircraft maintenance, but you could make it more efficient. Discretionary activities were also activities which could create strategic advantage. For example, leadership development. We also collected data on time and costs associated with each activity undertaken. We created a cost-benefit matrix to assess the value contribution of all discretionary activities. And the key result areas were used to construct the benefit axis and used to evaluate the contribution of activities undertaken by Defence Forces to successfully achieving its mission. The Defence Forces were asked to look at the opportunities to increase the amount of high-value discretionary activities, reduce or eliminate non-low value adding activities, and also look for opportunities to improve efficiencies of fundamental activities. There was an overall assumption that spend wouldn't be reduced, and this was an exercise to realign activities to higher value and make sure that they were much more efficient. And that was kind of, the theme for both pieces of work. The second piece went into more detail. But personal opinion is that since we did this work, two things seem to have happened. The first is the strategic and operational situation the military finds itself in seems to have got progressively worse every year as, possibly an uninformed outsider. And it seems to be, we got to a situation where the defense forces are being hamstrung from being effective. And the second one is that the world seems to be a darker, more dangerous place compared to back in the 1990s when we did the work. The world is less transparent, there's more covert and it's a far more suspicious place. The arms race is back and the assumptions of stability are being unraveled. So what are the lessons from the work that we undertook previously and from sort of the commercial world? I think the first lesson is that there are things we should do that we didn't do last time. And I'd say the first one is stand back and develop an overall defense and security vision for the future. We need to look at horizon and interconnected risks. We need to look at Ireland's security needs in a holistic fashion, probably part of the European Union, and also to look at the wider ecosystem in which Ireland and indeed the defence forces operate. For example, and these are issues which my commercial clients and government clients abroad deal with. We know that the Russians and Chinese interests are intent on destabilizing the European Union, which includes Ireland as part of that. We know that global firms who operate in Ireland are under threat from a range of security threats. We know that nuclear detente has collapsed. We know that the weapons of warfare have dramatically changed to cyber, digital, economic, biological, and social ordinances. And the list goes on and will dramatically evolve quickly over time. And we can't look at the defence forces as any organisation in isolation. We need to stand back and look at the entire ecosystem that's involved with and its role and the requirements and the overall requirements for defence and security. I think the second lesson is we can't use traditional techniques to evaluate what an organisation like Defence Forces undertakes. For example, there's a lot of talk about using benchmark, and I remember doing strategy work for the public sector. It's always, can we compare ourselves to a small country like New Zealand or whatever else? I don't think that works anymore. And if you are going to use benchmarks, you need to make sure you're using the right one. And you don't necessarily revert to this small states example unless their situation is totally relevant. And the other thing is, spend can't be curtailed or managed using incremental budgets and traditional approaches to risk management. I mean, the COVID pandemic has exposed these failures in particular. And the third lesson, I think, is probably the most important one, and this is one which a number of my colleagues have written some books on, is to assume the unthinkable and the unpalatable. Now, for example, and I'm using this commercial example as a good benchmark, we're moderating a one-day conference in 2 weeks' time for one of the world's largest corporate investment firms. And they've called together the chairs and CEOs of nearly 200 firms they have a significant or controlling interest in. And these include banks, electronic firms, energy companies, defense manufacturers, and hospitality firms. And the three key messages which are being delivered by the investors, and these I think are relevant to the work being undertaken by the Commission. The first one is, there is a new reality. Stability is being rolled back globally. There's no point hoping it's not. Every organisation and political leader must now underpin every judgment, every decision, however uncomfortable and counterintuitive, and be in a position to think the unthinkable and think the unpalatable. Secondly, there is a thick, large, impenetrable permafrost throughout any organisation, governments, commercial organisations, whatever, which must be made much more aware of these risks. They must become much more agile and responsive to the new reality. And management must be sufficiently equipped, leadership must be sufficiently equipped to engage with these challenges and lead organizations through this change journey. And a new type of leader is required actually now. And transformation is predicated on clear purpose, raison d'etre, stakeholder engagement, ecosystem cooperation, and the right culture and competencies. So similar to these firms, we must assume things will be no longer guaranteed to remain the same. Worse still, unthinkable and unpalatable means that you must now turn most of your assumptions on their head. We move too slowly or cautiously, then we are left seriously exposed. We live in the age of systemic instability. Ireland must be intellectually and be professionally prepared to address its defence and security needs. We need to be creative, imaginative, even ambitious, dynamic, responsive, and ready to face new challenges of this unpredictable future. And we must be able to think the unthinkable and ready to face the unexpected. And we must have defence and security competencies and capabilities that address the requirements, threats, and opportunities of this systemic instability. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Lots of food for thought, much of it bleak, but at the same time very realistic. So thanks very much, Ray. I'll now like to hand over to our next speaker for this evening. Our next speaker this evening is Neil McDonnell, CEO of ISME and former member of the Defence Forces. As I mentioned earlier, Neil will be talking about some of the issues that he feels are important to focus on this evening around why is it that so few business opportunities exist for SMEs, and why is the defence industry a taboo subject in Ireland. We'll be looking at the impact the defence forces can have on Ireland's global footprint, and considering how to increase the interplay between the defence forces and the political and the business world. Neil joined ISME as Chief Executive in 2016. He's previously served as an infantry officer in the Irish Defence Forces, as a staff officer in Defence Forces headquarters, and in operational roles in Lebanon and Cyprus. Neil also managed petroleum distribution operations for 12 years in Ireland for ExxonMobil, Topaz, and smaller domestic customers. Neil, over to you. You're muted there, Neil.
Thanks, Pat. Am I loud and clear? Okay. I will get the bad news out of the way first by saying that matters of defence policy and even business opportunities for SMEs in the defence sphere are a policy priority for absolutely nobody in small business, and possibly even large. I'm not going to speak for large business. I know Paul and Kevin will probably have something to say about that. But in 4 years in ISME now, it has never once been a question for me. And I suppose some of the things I'm going to talk about now are going to poke at why that is the case. The first observation I would make, and I deliberately make this observation in the context of Brexit, is that Ireland Inc. in general and the Defence Forces in particular is missing a real opportunity for defence diplomacy globally. And I mean defence in a much wider sense than merely defence, offence and hardware and fighting and all that sort of thing, or peacekeeping. If you look at the military.ie website and you go into the peacekeeping page and you just look at the missions and geography profile since Ireland joined the UN, the footprint across the planet is really, really significant. And we don't use that. We don't exploit it sufficiently politically, and we don't exploit it diplomatically. We don't have defence attaches around the world, for instance. As Pat said, I did 2 trips in Lebanon and then a very nice year in Cyprus. But what was very intriguing about Cyprus in particular, as what was a very static mission, was the extent to which other forces really exploited their on-the-ground presence there. And I'm thinking of the UK and Austria in particular. And effectively their battalions were extensions of their foreign services when it came to parades and celebrations and that sort of thing. I mean, I would observe by contrast that the Defence Forces appears to be tolerated at best by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, albeit my experience is from some time ago, but I have to say, reading the papers lately, the media reports don't suggest that has changed. Now, I referred to Brexit earlier, but one of the things that people probably don't know is that within the EU aid budget, which spends about 150 billion euro per annum, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, a little bit in South America. The UK was the most successful member state in claiming and drawing down spend from that. And then the Scandinavians and Nordics would probably be after that. Our success in grabbing that spend is about 10% of Denmark, and we have about 80% of the Danish population. So we're lagging really far behind the Finns, Danes, and Hungarians on that now. And just so you understand how that sort of stuff works, that's kind of civil society stuff, agriculture, drainage, security, education, and those companies and countries that avail of the EU aid budget, it's spent on domestic companies. So Finnish companies will go in and do work in Africa under the aid budget, and they'll be paid. The Finnish companies will be paid from the aid budget. So it's amazing expenditure. And those of you who aren't aware of it, have a look at the EU Aid Explorer.ec.europa. If you just go Google the EU Aid Explorer, you'll see the billions that have been spent annually and hoovered up by our EU partners. And take for an example, a country that we have a huge history in, Congo. The biggest donor into the Congo under the EU aid budget is in the UK. Healthcare, roads, civil society, security, disease control, and agriculture. And for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing and don't think you're big enough to get involved in that sort of international tendering, our current chairman in ISME specializes in the formation of intercompany consortia. So I would strongly encourage any of you thinking of tendering for business or other opportunities domestically or abroad to consider that. So we're failing to exploit the potential of our overseas footprint from a business point of view. And yet at the same time, we saw the value of that global footprint when we got a seat on the Security Council. So it does work. And just to explain really simply the sorts of stuff that you can exploit, I got a call simply because someone knew I was in the army a long time ago. A Methodist charity in Dublin wanted to get containers into the mountains in Lebanon, where there's such a significant aid effort going on. But they had real difficulty in getting through the paperwork at the port of Beirut. Just a couple of phone calls to old army contacts, and I was able to put them in touch with the right people to get them all the way from dockside all the way up into the mountains. So that local knowledge is hugely important. Now, on a more military expenditure side, we, Ireland, will contribute 250 million over the next 6 years into the EU Defence Fund. But there doesn't seem to be any desire on the part of the state or Enterprise Ireland or whoever to recoup some of that to spend back into our SMEs, back into our third level institutions. And that spend is not, people who think that that's exclusively around weapons and aircraft and ammunition and whatnot. You know, the sorts of things, if you go on to the Defence Fund website, you'll see it's chemical, biological, radioactive threat detection, drone systems, secure communication, cyber situational awareness, I am reading this stuff, and maritime surveillance. And we really do have superb capability in those arenas. We have the people and technology to excel in those areas. And a really good example from a couple of years ago, and you may have seen me doing some press on it, was the IMERC maritime cluster in Cork, which was a consortium between Cork Institute of Technology, UCC, the Maritime College, and the Naval Service. That was a superb exemplar of how you can have knowledge and technological transfer between educational institutions and the defence forces. And unfortunately, and obviously, this is an open source conversation, so I won't go into too much detail, but it was wound down for reasons that are quite dubious. I'm delighted to say that the former chief executive there, Val Cummins, superb operator, she's now thriving in offshore wind, but that's the sort of thing that really should have continued. It was a superb initiative. If I give you some hope, I suppose on the one side, what's very depressing from this point of view is the lack of vision and ambition to drive this sort of stuff on. If you compare what I'm just talking about, the winding up of IMERC with what happens elsewhere, and I'll talk about that in a second. I do want to say though, because an observation I would make about my current and former Defence Force colleagues is people tend to be quite introspective and don't take a wider perspective on why things don't work so well. The lack of ambition I'm talking about is not unique to defence policy. And, you know, I used to have hair before I became a lobbyist, and I can just tell you that this dysfunction now and lack of ambition and lack of vision goes across all the significant executive functions. You see it, and the OECD is commenting on it in our dysfunctions in health, dysfunction in justice, education, finance, transport. We're actually going backwards in some areas, in education in particular. I mean, basic concepts of numeracy, literacy, and problem-solving ability. Ireland's score against its OECD peers is reversing. So we have significant challenges there. So, you know, don't think it's all about problems in defence. By comparison then, and if I want to give you a really interesting international comparator, and anyone who thinks that the Mossad spends most of their time running around shooting people, if you haven't heard of libertad.gov.il, look at it after this event this evening. Anyone who read books about the Mossad before, by way of deception or any of those things, knows that the Mossad had a very commercial bent for many years. Now they don't even, it's not even secret anymore, and they have an English language website doing startups for high-tech people like Pat's company now, and they'll invest. That's how ambitious they are about it. And we're trying to do the same thing via Dog Patch Labs on the docks, which is a great place, great people, great initiative. But it's that, by comparison, the level of ambition here is tiny. And that finds its way then into the commercials of the economy. If you look at the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, and bearing in mind that Israel does not have twice our population, but the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has 440 listed companies. We have 43. And so the point I would make there is there's no point in our government turning Barrow Street into Silicon Docks if we don't have a real plan to manage the spread of that technology, to really get the startup infrastructure going and scale on a much more ambitious basis. Now, we know that Israel piggybacks a huge amount of that on their defense spend, but you know, there's no reason we can't do a little bit of that, but the trickle down from Silicon Docks isn't happening. If I kind of finally talk about, you know, I just don't want to be negative, and how do we talk about how we redress this, I would say that the first observation is that the media treatment of anything military related, unless it includes, it's about terrorism or bombs or something, it's quite shallow. Yet when I meet my cohort of reps in Brussels, defence is a really live issue for people from the Baltic states and Sweden and Finland. Those people perceive themselves as under threat. We, on the other hand, I think personally we suffer from the absence of a reserve, and the rundown of the reserve means that back in the day, 20 years ago, when I was serving and the local FCA commandant ran the garage and someone else was a publican and someone else was a hairdresser, that interface is gone now. The only notable people you can see publicly that have a connection with the reserve are Lisa Chambers and Maria Walsh. But we need to have a business interface there. And it could make a real contribution. And especially something like a reconstituted first line could help address some of the critical shortages we have in the Air Corps, the Naval Service, Ordnance, civil engineering, and the medical. We could use a reserve as a tool for employers, for small employers in business. And I'm thinking especially in the more high-tech areas, in cyber or artificial intelligence or simulation. Those people have very flexible ideas about work-life balance. And the Defence Forces can never compete with those businesses from a HR or a salary perspective, but they could accommodate them within a reserve if we had that vision to accommodate them. Those people aren't going to do a 6-month enlistment to become a 3-star. They're not going to do an 18-month cadetship, but they would be more than willing to serve as a reservist. And the reserve is way too narrowly defined in the white paper as it stands. Lastly, I would say that we have to recognize the realities of the political system, and there's simply too much inertia to overcome the political apathy there is now. Our political system, as I said earlier, is overwhelmingly short-term. We do, however, have, and I see some of them on the call this evening, some retired officers who are really contributing in a very high-quality way to the media, but it's a very limited contribution. So I think a couple of things we might focus on. One would be to, tease out the need for a dedicated security or defence correspondent within the major media outlets. And secondly, one thing I would like us to consider is a think tank, something like the Cato Institute that would engage in longer term strategic thinking and serve as a counterweight to the kind of media orthodoxy. So that's it from me. And if anyone is interested in pursuing any of those kind of contacts, I'd be very happy if Pat passed on their contacts afterwards.
Thanks very much, Neil. I'm going to, without further ado, call on Kevin McPartlan, CEO of Fuels for Ireland. Kevin McPartlan, CEO of Fuels for Ireland, the organisation which represents the interests of the Irish oil and liquid fuel sectors. He has previously led industry and product associations in the food and drink sector for IBEC and provided communications and public affairs services to campaigns, SMEs, multinational corporations, and even national governments. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Pat. Just important to say that this is purely personal capacity, nothing to do with my current employer or anybody else. It might be helpful just to get back to basics and focus on the issue in hand. So the Programme for Government commits to establish a Commission on Defence to undertake a comprehensive review which will include the following masses: arrangements for the effective defence of the country at land, sea and air, structures for governance, joint command and control structures, the brigade structure, pay and allowances and composition of the Defence Forces, recruitment, retention and career progression, and the contribution of the Reserve Defence Forces. Now, I'm a wussy civilian, and I don't understand brigade structures and I don't understand all those technical parts, so I'm going to ignore all of that and concentrate on that first piece, the arrangements for the effective defence of the country, and see what role business might have to say in that. Now, with one exception, I can't miss an opportunity to say it's an absolute disgrace that we have members of the Defence Forces who are so poorly paid that they're relying on supplementary welfare from the social welfare system. But that's going to be addressed elsewhere, I'm sure. So, as a nation, we have this very complex and often contradictory relationship with our Defence Forces. There's this cultural unease and with the modern realities of defence and military action, and particularly international cooperation. And we seem far more happy celebrating soldiers building sandbag flood barriers and clearing snow than we are of highly trained military professionals undertaking dangerous and critical missions on behalf of the country and the international community. And that unease, that discomfort, that kind of sniffiness around it has stifled genuine policy debate on issues relating to defence. And you only need to see the fact that some people regard using the word neutrality as an end to any discussion on debate on defence policy. And our political leaders have long dodged genuine discussion. You know, they're perfectly happy to celebrate those aid to civil power, the aid to civil authority, and the ceremonial duties than they are to talk about the less fluffy side of what it is to be part of the defence forces. And that has had an impact on the country's relationship with business and the defence sector. Government's exceptionally slow to celebrate the remarkable success of Moog or Timony or Class Telecom. And in fact, the IDA, I think Neil adverted to this, the IDA has a policy against supporting business in 3 sectors. And those 3 sectors are pornography, gambling, and defence. So, you know, I don't know which you feel closer to, whether it's pornography or gambling, but that's where you're being lumped in. So the Commission on Defence's considerations of arrangements for the effective defence of the country at land, sea and air offers an opportunity to challenge those attitudes. And I'm wide open to being told that this is an extreme proposal and that I know nothing and should go back and, you know, start talking about petrol pumps again. But I genuinely believe that part of this consultation process, part of this commission, or part of the preparation for a commission on defence should include a citizens' assembly, because I actually think as a nation we need to really critically review our attitude to defence. And I think just as at the start of the citizens' assembly, which led to the referendum to repeal the 8th Amendment, minds were changed by careful, considered, unemotive analysis. And I think we need to do that. And for me, a citizens' assembly would be a good route to do that. The value of a service personnel deployed on international missions and how Irish businesses being involved in the defence industries in and of itself will increase our international strategic influence and power. And I think that needs to be a focus that we adopt. It's coming back to Neil's point about, you know, the diplomatic value and benefit of the work that we do. And I'll give you one admittedly anecdotal example. But I spent a bit of time working for the government of Uganda and have become friends with one of the guys who was a minister when I was there. And the last time I was out, about 18 months ago, we had dinner, and he was telling me a bit about his family. And his father had been educated in a school run by Irish religious brothers. And that was his father's understanding of Ireland. That was how his father encountered Ireland. His nephew is Somali, and his nephew was trained by members of the Irish Defence Forces in a training operation in northern Uganda. And he talked about his nephew's experience of the professionalism of those service people who trained him, but also of the respect that they showed them, the values that they brought to the place, the commitment that they made to the local community, the fact that they opened up their own medical facilities to the local community, they got involved, they helped build or do some building work, I can't remember exactly what it was, to the local school. The relationship that the religious brothers and sisters and priests had half a century ago in terms of being our global ambassadors, particularly in the developing world, is now being undertaken by our defence forces, and it is entirely ignored. And it's an absolute waste of that opportunity that Neil described of the diplomatic value of all of those things. So how do we make sure that this commission doesn't descend into a mere forum for pay negotiations? Because I fear that that's the focus in government. That's what they think this is about. It was a way of kicking the can down the road and talking about pay. I think the important task right now is to influence the drafting of the consultation document, the consultation process. So what are the things that we need to get into it? And what, from a business perspective, can the business community add? So the question has to be asked about the role of the defence sector in Ireland. You know, how can it ensure that we're brought along and contribute to the innovative journey on an international level? I don't think we are going to, in Ireland, discover the next or develop the next supersonic fighter aircraft. That's not the pond that we're fishing in. But I do think that there is the capacity in Ireland for some of those smaller companies, those research and development oriented institutions to contribute to those things. And that's how Europe is doing it. You know, the European defence bonds are all designed on this, to have a collaborative approach across the European Union to R&D on defence issues. And I think that we need to be getting involved there, because by being involved, by being part of that process, we broaden the sphere of our influence and power on a strategic level. My personal view, speaking as somebody who runs a trade association, is that the defence sector needs a trade association. You know, I think that they need to come together, they need to speak with one voice, they need to get into government and lobby and stop being ignored. You know, I say that, as Pat said, my day job is running the industry association for the liquid fuel sector, which didn't get involved in any lobbying, didn't get involved in any real debate for 30 years, got kicked all over the pitch, and until 2 years ago they decided they were going to up their subs, up their engagement and hire me. And it's not about me, but hire somebody to get in and get involved in those conversations. And the impact that it's had over the last 2 years has been remarkable. And I think the same could be achieved very easily for the defence sector. I think this group would be essential in making sure that message gets through. So many former members of the Defence Forces and officers have gone on to excel in other areas of life. They have considerable political, commercial influence, and I think that they need to be asked to flex those muscles. So the first thing you need to do is to determine what are the desired outcomes from the Commission on Defence. You know, what is it you want the Commission to conclude? Then focus your attention on ensuring that the consultation asks the questions that invite the answers that you want to give. I think that the lobbying starts now. It doesn't start when the consultation begins or the Commission is beginning to sit. It's how you influence the documents that will support those processes. And my approach to this, for what it's worth, is to break it down into three parts. The audiences, the messages, and the channels. So to define the audiences, we're talking about who are the primary policymakers, who are the decision makers here. It's the minister, the people who are going to draft these important consultation documents, who are going to set the agenda for this commission. And around them, the Oireachtas committee and a few other people. That primary audience is probably going to be 30 or 40 people. The secondary audience are those who influence it, the people around them. So that's all the other members of the Oireachtas, it's serving personnel, former personnel, their families, people who have the potential to influence that primary audience. Then we need to look at what are the messages. So what do you need that primary audience to understand, feel, and believe? What are the and that needs to be a short number of absolutely key messages. And once you have those two bits done, you can think about what are the channels. So what is the most effective means to deliver those key messages? So if you're thinking about the Secretary General of the department, I'm sure it's a face-to-face meeting. If you're thinking about every member of the Oireachtas, it's probably briefing documents and perhaps a couple of events or something like that. But that's the approach I would take. Think about the audience, think about the messages, and then think about the channels, how you get through to them. I fundamentally believe that this Commission on Defence presents, as Pat said, potentially a unique opportunity to reframe the debate on defence, the defence forces, and the defence sector in Ireland. And I really hope that the opportunity is grasped. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Looking forward to getting back to some of those points as well with some of the questions coming in. Our final speaker this evening is Paul Farrell. Paul is Country General Manager for IBM Ireland. Paul styles himself as a scientist by education, a soldier by profession, and a management consultant by accident. He's been with IBM for 15 years, initially as a partner, the Irish consulting business, and latterly as GBS country leader, before then joining GBS UKI management team. In May 2018, he was appointed General Manager IBM Ireland, with responsibility for both the commercial operations and the research, development and innovation operations in Ireland. He holds a BSc in experimental physics, an MSc in computer science, and an honorary PhD from UCG. He's also a board member of the American Chamber, a member of IBEX National Council, and a member of the Royal Irish Yacht Club. Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Pat. It sounds an awful lot better when you say it than when I do. So let me start off, folks, by saying that these are my own personal views. They don't reflect the policy or the views of IBM necessarily, but they are informed by nearly 30 years in total of working with or for global multinationals, and also having worked with a number of both departments of defense and militaries in different countries across Europe in that time. So the three things I'd like to cover are, first, the economic imperatives for a strong defense posture in today's fractured global economy. Secondly, the role of cybersecurity in that defense posture. And thirdly, how Ireland can benefit both economically and socially from a grown-up debate on defence. So let me take the first, the economic imperatives for a strong defence posture. Look, it goes without saying, we are a small open economy which has benefited enormously over the past 50 years from the development of rules-based global trade. One example of this is the way in which our economy, and in particular our FDI sector, has weathered the COVID storm with less immediate damage than other nations. And I qualify that by less immediate damage. This has been as a result of a number of factors. One, the existence of rules-based economic order, acceded to by the key global players. Two, a stable and peaceful trading environment. Three, membership of the EU along with our nearest trading partner. And four, the fact that we have managed to transition to a knowledge economy. So let me take the first, the rules-based economic order. It is, as some of the previous speakers have pointed out, it is under enormous strain with the US-Chinese trade war in full flight and a spancel WTO. It also has an increasingly protectionist or nationalist strain emerging in, unfortunately, many of the world's leading economies. And this poses particular challenges for us. We have been great beneficiaries of global trade and that rules-based order, even in areas of taxation. And I would say that the current OECD BEPS program will ultimately work to our benefit. I'm not afraid of it in the way that some people are. The second factor was the stable and peaceful trading environment, and this is particularly important. Conflict disrupts trade, and small open economies suffer worst. Our balance of payments depends on goods, services, and most importantly, data, continuing to move seamlessly around the globe. The third factor, membership of the EU, along with our nearest trading partner, is already disrupted. Britain has left the family home. All we're arguing about now is who gets the kids and who pays the divorce bill. Whatever way it goes is not going to be to our benefit. And the final factor is the managed transition to a knowledge economy. This is, I would argue, the greatest single factor in our growth over the last 30 years. We've aligned our educational systems more swiftly and more comprehensively with the needs of a knowledge economy than any other country in our immediate orbit. The fact that our income tax take has not collapsed as swiftly as other countries in the last 6 months demonstrates that the knowledge industries, already enabled for remote working, have been able to continue functioning with relatively little disruption. So where does a strong defence posture come into the equation? Well, the first point is that a rules-based economic order is based on cooperation and collaboration, not just in economic organisations, but also in mutual defence and security tasks. Our ability to participate in UN and EU missions, or indeed in oversight organisations such as the OSCE, demonstrates our commitment to global cooperation and gives us a significant lift in our diplomatic and political clout. Our physical commitment to overseas missions through the defence forces, intervening in countries in which we have no selfish interest, helps the world's community prevent, minimise and contain regional conflict that would otherwise spark wider and much more disruptive conflict. And obviously, at a local level, we must be able to police and prevent exploitation of the national question, bringing renewed violence to our shores, whether from clumsy fallout from Brexit or an aggressive push for reunification, all capitalised on by hostile actors exploiting the tools for hybrid warfare, those offered by social media and, I have to say, our minimal counterintelligence capabilities. Our membership of the EU will require us at some point to be honest, clear and open about our defence posture after the conclusion of Britain's withdrawal. While much has been written about our outsourced air defence, very little has been written about the myriad training and doctrinal exchanges with the UK. And one has to ask, what will replace this? Finally, and for me most immediately worrying, is the exposure of our knowledge economy to the perils of hybrid warfare. And this brings me to my second theme, the role of cybersecurity in the defense posture. So look, security is primarily the responsibility of the companies and organizations responsible for their own IT. But the nature of the interconnected knowledge economy demands that states, such as Ireland, provide a robust cybersecurity environment that, in the first instance, provides a strong legislative framework that sets out responsibilities, defines cybercrime, deters cyber offences, and ensures a robust response in real time. Secondly, that polices the cyber economy and is in a position to detect, deter, and prosecute cyber offences. And thirdly, provides a cyber defence capability that robustly detects, intercepts, and destroys hostile actions by any party, up to and including state actors, on the state's cyber infrastructure as well as its physical infrastructure. And in today's economy, that includes our utilities, our health infrastructures, and most importantly, our financial infrastructure, which is, as we've seen recently, horribly exposed to cyber attack. Indeed, it can be argued that fake news spread by social media is as much a threat to the legitimacy of our democratic institutions as anything that Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act sought to prevent in the 70s and 80s. While point one, the legislative framework, is clearly the responsibility of the NCSC, and two, that of the Gardaí, I would argue that the third element, providing that cyber defence capability, can only be fulfilled by the defence forces, supported by a strong coalition of private sector security players and an integrated threat reporting and assessment function. But lest I have completely depressed you at this point, there are benefits here. And I'd like to talk briefly about how Ireland can benefit economically and socially from a grown-up debate on defence. Many of the excellent IDFOC sessions have quoted that we have the lowest defence expenditure in the EU. It's worse than that. If we strip out the cost of pensions, we're an order of magnitude lower than all of our EU partners. However, it has to be asked, what are we defending? And this is the start point for the discussion, I believe, with the wider population. If you agree with my views earlier that a globalized free trading knowledge economy in a trade system governed by mutually agreed institutions is important, then what we are defending is our future. But let's look at it in hard economic terms. And this is something I believe is going to be very important in holding the debate with the Commission. And I'm going to speak here specifically about the area that I know best, multinational companies. I'll let Neil talk to ISME and their population, but 20% of all employment in Ireland is attributable to FDI companies. It's bidirectional. Irish firms employ more Americans in America than American companies do in Ireland, and that gives us enormous soft power. Our total tax base for 2019 was 58 billion. Now, 7.6 billion was paid by FDI corporations in direct corporation tax, with a conservatively estimated 2.5 billion of VAT, PRSI, and income tax on top of that. That's 10 billion of 58 billion of a take. Multinational companies also invest directly in the Irish economy, and that's been sized by the IDA at approximately 19.2 billion. Now, the key point here that I want to make is that all of that is mobile. And you would be surprised to know how mobile it is. We've typically stated that the reason MNCs are located here is because of our tax regime or our highly educated workforce. But the most important factor is that we have a stable, secure, operating society. And a huge part of that is our ability to defend ourselves against both internal and external threats. The FDI companies house data, intellectual property and production capacity here. In my own industry, the intellectual property is valued in hundreds of billions, if not trillions of euro. And we have neither the naval capacity to detect attacks on our undersea cables, the counterintelligence capability to detect and defeat human attacks, nor the air or ground assets to secure our data infrastructure, which we must remember houses so much of Europe's personal data against hostile action. A properly conducted defence review with the broadest terms of reference can not only address these gaps, but could form the basis of, as Kevin mentioned earlier, a defence industry focused on defence against broad spectrum hybrid warfare. In other words, using our own current weaknesses as an asset by taking our own medicine first. But first we have to socialise this debate on our defence posture. And in these webinars, we've heard much about the lack of discussion of defence matters. There's much confusion in Irish society about our defence posture, and most people confuse neutrality, non-alignment, pacifism. At 500 pages, there are 5 mentions of the defence forces after the Civil War. 3 relate to World War II, and only 2 relate to the UN, and both of those relate to a specific 1-year period in the Congo. The only mention of the Air Corps relates to their flight pasts at the Ecumenical Congress in 1932 and the 1966 celebrations of the Easter Rising, but at least they get mentioned. There is no mention of the naval service in our standard history textbook for all of our children. Interestingly, the term the Army is used throughout to refer to the British Army, and by comparison, RTE gets 47 mentions. There is, however, a strong sense of national pride among most of our citizens. There is, of course, a strong vein of cynicism towards established politicians, but we're not unique in that. I've seen exactly the same and worse in my postings in the UK, and making clear the essential nature of defence to our economic well-being. Then and only then can we have a grown-up discussion on defence and the role of the defence forces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Some really great insights there. I'm going to start with some questions, and I'm going to come to Ray initially. Just make sure, Ray, are you still there?
Yeah.
How are you? Yeah, Ray, I'm going to come to one question, and it's going to pick up on something that you mentioned and something one of the of our audience is asking about, like the last reviews that you were involved in. I suppose one of the problems with doing a review in a straightforward way is that sometimes it doesn't get used in the way it was intended. So the recommendations can be cherry picked from it and used to justify, we'll say, outcomes that may not be what was intended from the report. Is there anything you do differently now? And I suppose if you were advising the Commission what they should do to make sure that A, the best possible report comes out of this, and B, what's kind of key here is, even if it is a great report, how do we make sure that it's executed properly in the way that it's intended to?
Yeah, I think the last piece of work was very limited in terms of the stakeholders who were engaged with it. And, you know, I think this requires much wider consultation and involvement. You know, at the time, you could see the difference of opinion between the Defence Forces and the department. And I remember seeing it almost as an enactment of Yes, Minister, a TV program around the time. And, you know, I think today you need, you know, to engage public opinion, you know, you need to engage industry. And as Paul had indicated, there's a much wider ecosystem involved here in the defence and security matters, both on the island and actually within the European Union. And, you know, we are all part of that. We are all joined up. You know, we're in a very much more joined up world. And I think that is really important, that all those stakeholders be involved. I think the second thing is that, in my opinion, that there's a blurring of roles around security and defence, and you know, you have Army or Air Corps or Navy. I think we need to take a much more strategic view of those issues, and it needs to be a transparent process. I think we have to recognize that there are professionals within the defense forces who need to be respected, who have very strong opinions, are very capable individuals, and they've gone on, left the army, as most others are Corps Navy, and been very successful in their careers. And I think there needs to be a really strong involvement of those groups in any work that's undertaken.
And do you think it's difficult, with your time on the previous reports, applying, we'll say, standard business metrics or analysis frameworks to a military organization? Or do you think are there specific military analysis frameworks that should be used? Or what have you learned?
I think, traditionally we looked at, a lot of business techniques were based on military techniques, if you like. And, a lot of the, even the newer techniques we're using around like dynamic capabilities from a strategy point of view is actually based on, US military experience and whatever else. But, I think there's a lot of stuff which goes on in business, a lot of techniques that we used, which have just become so advanced, and they're very applicable to what we're doing. So, we're using neuroscience now in a way we didn't use before. We're using dynamic simulations and artificial intelligence to understand what the implications of issues are very quickly and be able to run scenarios dynamically to any situation. So, no, I think there's industry has moved on so fast in terms of technology and the way it actually looks at problems. That's why I use this example of those investors that we're dealing with. I mean, they understand these security issues, they understand the realities of it, and they're using very modern and appropriate techniques which actually apply to any particular organization. And the fundamentals of this new world are around ecosystems, around stakeholders, around communications, and around actually having a very strong vision and purpose. It doesn't matter what type of organization you are. There's still very valid principles.
Okay, thank you. Neil, I'll come to you next. I suppose you spoke about your engagements across a number of different government departments, and you had your opinions on those. I guess what I'd like to ask you about is, in the Programme for Government, it actually talks about a commission on the defence forces. In this forum, we're talking about a commission on defence because we feel that looking at the defence forces on its own is too narrow, and it needs to take into account the Department of Defence and all the key stakeholders. What would your thoughts be on that? And if you think it should be on defence, not just defence forces, how do you go about moving that that opinion and getting it embedded in this commission?
Couple of observations, and the first one, by the way, I would just come back to what Ray had said, and I see I think it was Ger Hearn there with the observation on PwC. I was serving at the time of that. I was down in Limerick, and I think it's missing the it's likely missing the point to an extent when you zone in on who the consultants were rather than what was done by the executive with the report they produced. By comparison, if you look at what happened when the management consultants went into the Gardaí, there was no change, and we're still suffering the sort of outcomes being talked about now by the OECD. This isn't an internal pointing fingers at another security agency. This is external, internal.
Lost it there, Neil. Hello.
Oh, sorry. I'll turn off my picture because I'm fighting against some TikTokers upstairs, so it's a bit tricky. So back to your question, Pat, I would say it is important that it is on defence in its widest social sense rather than the defence forces. But B, I would also say I'd come back to the observations I'm making about other. I'm going through exactly this process now in the Department of Business and Enterprise with OECD reports on entrepreneurship, and the Economic Survey of Ireland produced this year. ISME has been saying to the Department of Business and Enterprise and to the Department of Finance for 10 years some of the stuff that the OECD is saying now. And what's actually absent is a champion, an executive with a vision and a determination to say, yes, this is right, this is what we are going to do. To a certain extent, I won't say it is irrelevant or it doesn't matter what we do, but we don't, and I think Ray did touch on some of the things we do need to do in terms of who are the key influencers. We do have to get the message across to a lot of people whose attention span is measured in spans of 10 minutes. I'm Zooming on calls with government twice a week, and you are trying to get them from week to week to commit to a long term on anything, and it's exceptionally difficult. And defense is only one area. I mean, there are areas of, we're talking about IDFOC tonight, so I won't go into bore you now with sláinte care, but you're now looking at people who are committing to spending 17 billion euro on healthcare without doing any cost benefit analysis of existing expenditure. So in some ways, I think we're very naive if we're expecting the bar to be set very high. This is a bit like the Trump-Biden thing last night. The bar here is very, very low, and we have a political infrastructure, an elected infrastructure, and a departmental, a DOD infrastructure that simply doesn't know what they're dealing with. So how are we going to handhold them through that is the question I would pose to you.
I certainly don't have an answer. What I will do is bring in Kevin McPartlan. And Kevin, you know, you're a professional lobbyist. You have had difficult conversations about difficult topics, and it's something that you've done for a living. I mean, if you were in charge of a defense lobby group, what would be the first thing you would be doing? What would be your focus? How do you make a conversation on defense that lots of people don't want to have? How do you bring it into the public sphere?
I think you need to have the context established in advance. So yes, the point that you made there about the programme for government talks about a commission on defence forces, but the first element of that it describes is the arrangements for the effective defence of the country at land, sea and air. Now, to me, you cannot have a discussion of the effective defence that only discusses the defence forces. So I would be talking about that now straight away, say, this goes beyond the defence forces. This is about, you know, all of these broader issues that we've kind of touched on this evening, albeit briefly, that all of those things that contribute to genuine defence of the state. So that means getting all of the different interest groups involved. And we have to get into an educative process in terms of, you know, addressing some of the points that Paul made, that some people seem to think that, you know, neutrality, non-aligned, and pacifism are all the same thing, you know, and genuinely, very occasionally, if my blood pressure is getting dangerously low, I listen to Liveline, you know, and whenever you listen to Liveline and it talks about the defence forces, what do they do all day? Sitting in the barracks, you know, there is no understanding of what the defence forces actually do. And to me, I'm telling you how right I was earlier on now, but to me, that is about saying, telling people in Ireland what the value of the defence forces is to our global reputation, what that means for business, what that means for our influence, what that means for our power in the world. And a lot of it is soft power. A lot of it is that influence that people have by going into international missions and doing outstanding work and representing Ireland in a way which we should be proud of. But we're unaware of it. People are not told. People like me, who are not ex-officers, who are not ex-service people, who have never, I don't have any family who are involved in the defence forces. I have a vague interest in this stuff because of some people that I used to work with. That's how I have an interest in this. But only for that, I would be as ignorant as 90% of the population who really don't understand what the defence forces do. So very long-winded, meandering, tangential answer, as you would expect from me, Pat. How do we start that debate? We start telling people what the Defence Forces actually do. And then we start talking about what defence actually involves beyond just the Defence Forces. I think that would be a good starting point. If that was established when this commission was being formed, when its terms of reference were being written, when the consultation for the terms of reference were being written, then you would have some chance of an effective process.
Great, thank you. Paul, going to come to you. And Ray touched on this, and a number of people touched on this tonight, actually, this raison d'etre, like the sense of purpose. Like, surely that's the foundational piece. And I think if you speak to members of the Defence Forces, there's never really a concern with a sense of purpose when they're serving overseas and they have that, you know, they're protecting people, they have their unit, they have their mission. But I think that often is lacking now domestically. So, like, what is the purpose? Like, where should we set it? If we're going to look at reinstating the 4th Western Brigade, should it be the 4th Cyber Brigade? You know, do we have to look at what are the modern threats and challenges and then set up Ireland to defend against those? Or is it going to be more business as usual?
So I don't think it can be business as usual, right? But there are two elements to it, two parts to your question, I think. The first one, and Kevin summarized it very well there, in terms of explaining to the population at large, and particularly to the body politic, what the purpose of the Defence Forces is. Because certainly when I was serving, and I think latterly, we have struggled to articulate the purpose of the Defence Forces, number one, and then from that, demonstrate the value of the Defence Forces. Now, I do think there is a reluctance on the part of both the, let's call it the elected government and the permanent government, to get into this, because it suits many parties to have what I can only describe as a supine defence establishment, from which money can be taken at the drop of a hat and allocated to other areas. We've got to remember that in the period after 2000, the Defence Forces was the only state agency which radically reorganised and re-energised itself without being kicked in the teeth to do it first. We closed barracks, we rationalised functions, and then we used the released funds to be able to re-equip the Defence Forces. But to a certain extent, we shot ourselves in the foot there. And I use the term we advisedly here, in that we demonstrated to the permanent government that actually, you know, left to themselves, these guys will actually get on and reorganize and be rational and so on. And part of it was the legacy of the Gleason report and the various PwC studies, which taught, I would suggest, the Defence Forces how to do this and how to critically examine itself. Now, how do we articulate or how do we engage the body politic in the value of the Defence Forces? It almost appears to me that we need a catastrophe to do it. We need a massive cyber attack or a massive cyber breach. But the problem is that previous catastrophes were limited in their scope, right? Brief digression. A number of months ago, I was at a business meeting, and we were talking around this topic, and somebody said, well, we've never had a Black Swan event in Ireland. And I had to point out to them that we had 30 years of a Black Swan event, which drained our political and economic capital while we tried to fight a holding campaign against a range of vicious terrorist organizations. But people have forgotten this, and it goes back to my educational point. We've got to teach people from the very earliest stage what the purpose of the Defence Forces is, not drop it in as something that we do just when there's a commission for defence. But to the second part of your question, the one about business as usual, I go back to that point about hybrid warfare. But what we can be is we can become specialists in hybrid warfare. or more correctly, for defense against hybrid warfare. So cyber war games that took place. And it was a brilliant example of permanent defense force and reserve defense force participation in a multinational engagement where we were able to work transnationally in defending, albeit in a war game, defending against a hybrid attack, where our specialist area was in relation to cyber. So while I wouldn't go as far as saying that the Western Brigade should be reconstituted as a cyber brigade, I do believe that we should be immediately constituting cyber, let's call it a cyber regiment or a cyber battalion, associated but not subsumed to CIS. I think it has
quarters, 5 forces, and all that good stuff. You know, you are going to probably start seeing there are issues that Ireland could develop capability in, which would allow them to be world leaders rather than being poor at a lot of things and okay at some things, to be world leaders at things. The Irish Defence Forces are already world leaders in peacekeeping, but like the concentration of foreign direct and be great at something, or do you think it's back to basics in that we should be just developing you know, capabilities that can surge if required, if there is this black swan event?
That's a good question. I kind of worry where a not-for-profit entity, state entity, tries to develop competencies in areas to either create revenue or attract funding because it's a commercial purpose. And a lot of the defense requirements, security requirements, whilst they have a defense and security benefit associated with them, that's really important. But I don't think there should be a profit objective there. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that the outcome of us having a strong defense capability brings with it a lot of benefits. It attracts organizations establishing themselves within the country. So, for example, a lot of our capability, we looked at a lot of for a lot of banks, you know, where they should settle on, you know, after Brexit, and you know, very often the security issues associated with Ireland, the cyber capability or lack of cyber capability in Ireland, were actually negative, I guess, conditions which may have put some organizations off actually settling in Ireland. So there are a lot of benefits associated with having a strong defense capability itself. So my own view is that you develop capabilities specific to your own specific requirements as a nation, and you need to understand the outcomes or the benefits associated with that and play to those benefits in the other sectors as a result. But your needs are your needs, and you play to those needs.
Great. Thank you. Neil, I'll go back to you. I guess it's the question around, I mean, you are lobbying Department of Enterprise Business and Innovation. That point that I think Kevin raised around the fact that defense, pornography and gambling companies are lumped in together, and that preclusion to support defense companies means that it's very unlikely we're going to see that 250 million coming back from the European Defence Fund. And in fact, it means that rather than getting it back to Irish SMEs, the Irish taxpayer is in fact subsidizing SMEs from other countries. Like, how do we go about tackling that? And by we, you know, I know Paul was speaking about we as the defense forces, and when we talk about we, we're talking about the wider defense community. Like, how do you start tackling that?
There I am.
Neil,
this is back to, I mean, I can only suggest as a methodology for attempting to do that, we are back into organizing our allies, and I do think our allies in in Silicon Docks. I do think all those multinationals that have an enormous stake in a physical and a cyber secure realm are our allies in this. I think the only way you're going to secure some sort of spend there is to target spending in those areas, and including in the marine. IMERC, unfortunately, I know I'm saying it a third time, despite the fact it's been wound up, but it was looking at maritime technologies in a way that is scalable and exportable. We do have, which you drive and you say, why should we be ourselves domestically? But I have to emphasize the problem, Pat, that we're really bad at this across the board. That's why I brought in the overseas aid debate. You know, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade should be ringing me saying, you know, how do we get Irish companies to secure this aid spend? And it's not happening. And they just don't have that vision. Whereas after the Brexit vote, I mean, my first few kind of diplomatic things that I attended on behalf of ISME, I can tell you I had the Portuguese, the Austrian and the Hungarian business attaches saying, the Portuguese guy was very impressive. He said, you know, the Brits are out now and we have all these contacts in Southern Africa and you have all the English speaking contractors. So can I do business with your people? I mean, it's that blunt. These guys aren't hanging around. They're not waiting for someone else to show them how to do it. But internally here, and I'm afraid it's not just in the Department of Finance, we just don't have people with the vision thing that join up these dots and aggressively go after these opportunities. Again, if you go into that Libertad website, you will see here is the Israeli Secret Service doing angel funding for fintech and bio and all this sort of stuff. So I'm afraid that across the board we have people who are extremely siloed and introspective in their business and commercial outlook, and there is going to have to be hand holding. And I don't want to pawn it off onto people like Paul and Ray, but it is, you know, the multinational sector which has had such a footprint here for so long is actually because they, you know, Leo Varadkar and Micheál Martin do not have my mobile number, but they do have Tim Cook's number on their phone. And those guys are the people who are going to say, and need to say, you need to sort this shit out. Otherwise, you know, the next fab isn't going into leak slip, it'll go somewhere else. It's that simple. That's how it works.
Okay, good to know. I'm just conscious of the time here, but two final questions, one for you, Kevin, and one for Paul. Kevin, like, the terms of reference obviously are key in the commission, but the other thing that could be key is the membership of the commission. Like, how important do you think the membership is, and what can be done to try to influence that?
Look, it's obviously crucial, and the two are not separate issues, because the terms of reference will include the suggested criteria for membership of the commission. So, you know, you need to attack them both at the same time. I think what you need to have are the people who are very clearly subject matter experts, and therefore, you know, ex-officers who have done important things afterwards. So there's a couple of them here on the panel. But also you need some kind of people who are less obviously aligned, but people who have an interest and have a demonstrable interest, and people to whom you know that you can have easy access. And I think that would be an important thing to do as well. So identify a couple of obviously aligned people and make sure they're pushed front and center. Don't have too much competition for those places. And then have a couple of people who are less obviously aligned, who can be just floated to the department as, you know, as a suggestion. Oh, have you thought about this fella or this woman? I've seen them talk about this stuff before. People who you know that you can get a good influence on. Because, look, I'm cynical about this stuff. You need to pack the commission. But I'm no more cynical than the people who will be, you know, opposing the outcomes that you wish. They will also be trying to pack it. So don't be too quick to rush the moral high ground. You know, you're going to have to fight dirty on this one.
Good to know. Paul, I suppose finally to go to you and to pick up, I guess, on Neil's point as well. So, like when we say we're the defence community here, and we want this to be the best possible outcome, but who has the influence? Is it the foreign direct investment companies? Is it, the political parties? Is it the likes of ISME and IBEC and these kind of groupings? Like, what is the best thing that we as a group can do to try to ensure the optimum outcome here?
Well, I think the representative to the Taoiseach or Tánaiste or to Pascal Donoghue in this regard, right? And in fact, I've been on a couple directly from the US government. The US government expressing concern or a nervousness around the vast holdings of US IP or data in Ireland and our ability to defend it, that would be listened to very, very strongly. As indeed would similar statements from the EU. And I think, well, I know two countries in particular have expressed concern at an EU level around aspects of cybersecurity related, particularly, it has to be said, to data protection and privacy. And there is an overlap, going back to one of the earlier points, there's an overlap here between cyber defense and data protection. And this is where there are allies that the defense community needs to form with the likes of the Data Protection Commissioner, with other organizations which have a legislative role. I mean, for example, the financial regulator. If I was the CEO of a pillar bank right now, and I knew that despite my best efforts implementing security protocols and procedures, that I'm still exposed to a national cyber attack, I would be banging on the door of the government, either directly people on the commission who are not necessarily believers, such as the people on this call, or ex-members of the Defence Forces like Neil and myself, but are people who get the threat. And there is something here, just as I speak, there's a community of chief risk officers engaged by this group or a wider group to talk about that wider systemic risk that we face as a nation, because shareholders will suffer in the end of the day.
Great, and thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to all of our speakers. I'm conscious, given the quality of the inputs, we've gone over our time, so I'm not going to go back around the houses, but I will just say thank you to all of our speakers. I think the level of insight that you've brought, there's a lot of food for thought there. And what I would say to everyone who's listening, and we say this every week, the one thing we can do is get onto our local representatives. We need to let our TDs and our councillors and our senators know that defence matters in Ireland. And it doesn't matter just in, as Kevin was saying, in an ACA or ATC. Again, to all of our speakers, and thanks to everyone who participated and asked questions. We look forward to our next event, which will be coming up in the next few weeks.